installment of our Den's Desserts with Den speaker series. Today we've got Jeremiah Morin that's going to talk to us about an afternoon with autism. My name is Bart Maxson. I'm a senior technical service and development scientist in the consumer care, home and personal care group, and I'm also the co-chair of Den with Miranda Bierman. The Desserts with Den is really Miranda Bierman's brainchild, so I want to give her credit for that. Some logistics for today's webcast. Webcast audience questions can be asked. If you click on the upper corner of your screen, click on the question mark icon, type in your question, and click Ask. The slides, in order to download the slides, you can go to the upper right corner of the screen, click on the paperclip icon, and click on the link, and click Save. So I'd like to introduce then Jeremiah. Jeremiah is our guest speaker today. Jeremiah is in the Human Resources Organization. He's a co-op currently working in the 2040 Talent Acquisition Group. He is a senior at Central Michigan University, studying English and business, and will graduate with a bachelor's degree this spring. I'd like to turn it over to Jeremiah. Thank you.
Hey, is this thing on? I'd like to take that as a yes. All right, so hello everyone. My name is Jeremiah Morin, and this is an afternoon with autism. So a couple quick notes before we start. We're gonna try to make this participation heavy with the audience. When I did this program previously at my university, we had some issues with my time being cut that they did not tell me beforehand, and so I may talk a little fast, or we may have to change things up at some point if we start to run a little low on time. So I apologize in advance. And there also may be some stints where it's just me lecturing a lot just because of the nature of the topic, so I apologize in advance. So let us get started. So let's kind of gauge the audience's experience with this topic. So raise your hand if you have a relative, a child, a close friend, anyone like that in your life who has been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Quite a bit of people. All right, and if you don't mind sharing, because of course I want everyone to be comfortable with what they're talking about, can you share what makes them different? What behaviors do they have that are unique to them as a person with autism?
Different social skills, different dynamics in their social interactions.
Yep, that's very true. That's a large part of it. Anyone else?
Yeah, they're very, very literal in their interpretation of language.
This is also very true, and that kind of feeds back into the social aspect. One more person? Yep, and we tend to see that as we go farther down the spectrum towards the more severe side, of course. That varies a lot, as we'll talk about. All right, so we've talked about the perception of people here. What about public perception? Because, of course, this is a global issue. Well, in terms of the American public, according to the National Alliance for Autism Research, they found with a pretty widespread amount of data that 75% of these people polled felt they were familiar with autism. At least that's what they felt. But we actually found that they had a relatively low autism IQ. Only 40% knew it was a developmental disorder, which is an important part, and only half of them knew that you can find symptoms of autism before the age of 5, and you can find it often in children as young as a few months old when you first start to see socialization really develop. And if someone with, say, more severe autism was diagnosed at age 5, we may consider that a late diagnosis. And then the funny and actually kind of disturbing statistic is that 35% of them learned about autism from a TV show primarily. I'm going to assume that's The Big Bang Theory because of the character Sheldon Cooper. I cannot say whether most people on the spectrum say bazinga. I think that may just be something of the character, but I will let you know if I find more information on that. So now let's talk about the perception of everyone here again. This is my favorite part. So we're going to do a blind poll. So based on my behavior up here alone, how I talk, how I walk, anything that I am displaying up here, when we do this blind poll, everyone will close their eyes and you'll raise your hand if you do or do not think, based on my behavior, I am on the autism spectrum. No maybes, just what is your gut telling you? And when I say that, I mean no reverse psychology, no external factors like, okay, some people may think, hey, you got this weird looking guy up here talking about autism, he has to be someone with it talking, but that wouldn't necessarily be fair to me. For example, my girlfriend is a social worker and she works with autistic children, and it's something she's very passionate about. She wants to open her own nonprofit someday in that topic. It wouldn't be fair to her to assume that she has it just because of that choice of passion or profession, so it wouldn't be fair to me in this case. So excluding all that, based on how I am acting right now in the flesh, we're going to see, do you feel more confident that I do or do not have it? So everyone close your eyes. No cheating. All right, raise your hand if you feel more confident that I do not have it. Okay. Hands down. Eyes still closed. Raise your hand if you feel more confident, based on behavior, that I do have it. Okay. I'm not offended, by the way. I'm usually the one creating the offense. So you can open your eyes, hands down. All right, so if people don't mind sharing, can one person who said they don't think my behaviors indicate it share why they voted that way? Anyone?
You're highly articulate and you speak very well.
All right, and someone who voted yes, why do you suspect that?
Again, hopefully not to offend, you seem to have a bit of a flat affect, not a whole lot of emotion. You sound great to me, to be clear. But I tend to be a highly hyper kind of guy, which is probably,
I think that's fair, yeah. I mean, in my personal opinion, I think it's better to be calm than very worked up about doing something like this, but to each his own, and that's a fair point. I have to come clean, all right? I said a moment ago I would not be offended if people genuinely thought my behavior suggests I have some form of autism spectrum disorder, and I'm a liar because I am a little offended for those of you who voted yes because you now know my superpower. I do have autism spectrum disorder. I was diagnosed with it, I think I was around 10 years old. It was around 6th or 7th grade. And the reason I do that kind of thing, and why when people come in and they're like, so do you have autism? I'm like, shh, we'll get to that, is because I like the idea of playing with audience perception. There'd be no point in me trying to full out lie because I just told you this thing. But when we talk about what someone with autism, quote unquote, looks like or acts like, I think it's important to kind of address that perception. And then of course I do the reverse psychology thing because everybody tries to factor that in, and I don't think it's always fair to do that, especially because a lot of symptoms of autism can be seen in people who are just shy. Anyway, so I want to touch on this really, really fast because I know somebody is always going to think about this in the back of their head because misinformation spreads very fast in our day and age. So you may have heard there was a research paper published in the late 90s that claimed to link the MMR vaccine and autism. This has been proven fraudulent many times, and to the point where there have been many research papers in themselves written about how fraudulent it was. There were conflicts of interest, there was manipulation of evidence, and the researcher in question has been banned from medical practice since 2010. All right, so if you're having a bad day, remember you haven't screwed up that badly yet. So, and I keep hearing it come up, and it's very bothersome for a number of reasons because the common thing is with MMR, it's to prevent things like measles. And if you're saying that you would rather have your child have measles than have autism, what does that say about the value of my life? But anyway, I just want to touch on that real quick. All right, autism vaccines, no equal sign. All right, that's out of the way. All right. All right, now we're going to talk about the actual spectrum. And I highlight this because it is a spectrum. As you can see here, there are a lot, okay, that text didn't show up right, but that's not the important part. There are a lot of different symptoms of someone on the spectrum. Someone with mild autism may not have any of these, all right? For example, I have a friend who has Asperger's who has very few of these ever on display. Also, for example, something that you see with autism a lot is sensitivity to certain types of sounds. I do not have that. Many of my friends who have Asperger's do not have that. It really is a spectrum, and that's why, and I'll talk more about this later on, I ask people not to look at me or really any one person they meet who has autism as a representation of the spectrum, because it is an incredibly complex multichromosomal disorder that has so much variation that even nowadays we still have trouble understanding sometimes. Also, before I have this question answered, some people may be wondering why I'm not coming up here and immediately talking about autism in the workplace. Because as we established with this poll, a lot of people in here are close to someone who has it. And so to me, especially if we're trying to make this about education, it's not enough just to talk about the workplace, because autism obviously exists outside of a vacuum. It exists outside of a workplace context. You may one day have a child or a grandchild or a friend or a relative, a coworker, whatever, who has this. And so I think that information, that knowledge, and just knowing how to approach someone who has this kind of disability is important, not just in a workplace context. It's something that builds characters, knowing how to deal with someone's differences that they inherently cannot help. So that question. So audience question time. What are the early warning signs, you can name just one, that a small child may have autism? Yep. Anyone else? Indeed.
Delayed speech.
Yep, we see that a lot. One more person. Yep, we definitely see a lot of intensive interests there. So those of you who answered or had an answer in the back of your head, you have a higher autism IQ than some of the people in that poll already, so give yourself a pat on the back for that. All right, so these are some very general warning signs we see, and as already pointed out several times, your mileage will vary. At 6 months, you often will not see big smiles, showing gestures like reaching for something they want and bonding. You know, a very small child will start to recognize their mother, and then they'll have a reaction to that. You may not see that. No babbling at 12 months, no words at 1.5 years. And by 2 years, you will usually not see meaningful phrases that aren't just repeating what they've already heard. Okay, now we're actually going to talk about what I have, which is mild autism, Asperger's, SCD, high-functioning autism. There's been a lot of debate about what to call it because the DSM-5 changed it. And so it's been called SCD in some places. I hear high-functioning autism a lot. And Asperger's apparently isn't used, but that's what I identified as my whole life. So I'm sure the next generation who has this will say it differently. And then moderate autism I'm going to group in here because there's a lot of things in common, just the severity is a little different, that for the sake of time and clarity, we're going to keep those together. Okay, so the difference between severe autism and more mild autism, just to get the record straight, is that you won't see a delay in cognitive or language development with more mild autism. There might be issues with it sometimes, but generally the actual pieces will be there. You'll see normal intelligence, and you will almost every single time see poor social skills, and not just talking like this person is shy, but imagine the difference between choosing not to socialize because you don't like it and not actually knowing the pieces of socialization and how to put them together. That's a way to distinguish the seriousness of it. Also repetitive movement, maybe you've noticed some of that in how I am behaving right now. Very intense interest, as someone mentioned a moment ago, and those kind of things will remain throughout life. And with more severe autism, they're very amped up, so to say. They're much more severe to the point where they can become an impairment in their own. Whereas some with more mild autism, it may just kind of be there, something that can easily be compensated for. But with more mild autism, there is the potential to gain full or mostly full independence. Because generally speaking, the goal of someone with a disability like this is you want social competency, because when you think about it, our society is incredibly social. We are social creatures, and you want to gain a degree of mostly full independence. So these two pictures are very representation of my life. That is my dad and me when I was much thinner. So I had a very restrictive and abnormal diet, which is very common with people with autism. I ate a can of, well, at one point I ate a can of Chef Boyardee spaghetti and meatballs, which I now regard as basically a plate of trash. But back then, I ate that literally every 2 or 3 hours, and I would make my mom, because of course I wasn't doing it myself, I was sitting around playing video games all day, definitely not talking to people. I would make sure she took the meatballs out, even though I loved any other form of meat. I was like, you have to take this out. I do not like it. I don't like it soupy. It has to be, kind of like the porridge thing from that bear story. It can't be too cold, too hot, just right. There can't be any little meat chunks. If my grandma made me scrambled eggs, it couldn't be too hot. The smell couldn't throw me off. And then I wouldn't eat it, period, even if it cooled off. Just push it to the side. I used to have this thing I did where I would take Pringle chips and I would crush them up into a bowl, and then I would mix them with ketchup and call it chips and ketchup, kind of like a very primitive cereal. That'd probably explain why my dentist didn't like me. Probably gave me gingivitis without knowing it. I also had some very intensive interests. I had a love for that ship, the Titanic, that went down like 100 years ago. There was a movie about it, maybe you heard of it, and that was something I always talked about. I had mood swings at times, and just very kind of aggressive moments over things that weren't really that important at times. I also processed information differently. I still do that sometimes now. For example, with math, I had a lot of trouble with because sometimes I would be doing, say, a new form of math if we just learned something new in a unit. And then I would look at things and I'm thinking, okay, well, I see that this is done a certain way, but what about this, this, and this? What about these factors? What if a number is negative? What if there's a decimal? And that alone would make me freeze up and make mistakes simply because I didn't like unknowns. And when I first started here, I had a lot of that happen when I worked in benefits with insurance and that kind of thing, because it's just built into me. It's something I have to learn to compensate for. And repetitive movements, I kind of touched on. I had this thing when I was younger where anywhere I went, in my house, if I went up our stairs, which is basically just kind of this tall, it's one stair, you step up again, you're in my living room, and no matter what, because I really like the number 6, I had to step on 4 times, which would just look like this, and then when I went down, it had to be twice. So I didn't care if my house was on fire, if my sleeve is incinerating, I was going to touch that step 4 times up, 2 times down, and I have no idea why. And then the social inability was probably the biggest one. Again, sometimes people just look at it as shyness, but when you consider how social and social dependent humans are, how much social competency is required to get a high-level position at Dow because of the need for connections and constant interaction and group work leadership, whatnot, there is a real need for that. And it's one thing to be shy, but if you don't know how to socialize, period, can you imagine trying to go through all those motions, especially if you don't really have a way to communicate with people, that there's something different about you without them, dismissing it in a negative way. And so that brings us to how I got here. That is me and my instructor from my old career center, and me and my ma and pa. You can see the effect of the constant Chef Boyardee in my figure. So I am currently on medication, have been on for a long time. So I currently take ibuprofen and Lexapro, kind of help balance out my moods. I think there's no shame in eating medication. A lot of people do. When you think about it, emotions are just chemicals and brainwaves. The fact that most of us are able to function without medication is a miracle, considering how random that is. But again, sometimes there is experimentation needed because of how complex that is. I am very lucky to have had the support circle that I've had throughout my life. My friends have always been very good to me and overall just very supportive. I forgot to mention this too with an example of the social issues. When I was growing up and the thing known as Facebook got introduced, I thought, this is my chance. I can talk to people without consequence. And so my only real way I thought I knew how to socialize was, well, what if they felt sorry for me? So I may come up to you in this hypothetical scenario and be like, hey, how are you doing? You look really pretty today. Someone's phone is going off. I'm feeling really depressed right now. I've kind of been thinking about hurting myself, maybe dying. Do you want to be friends with me? Do you want to go bowling sometime? And that sounds like a joke, but that's all I really knew a lot of the time was sympathy. And that obviously does not work that way. Most times people just wanted me to go away. And a few people did tell me, and I kind of thanked them in hindsight. But anyway, with that support circle I did eventually gain, I'm very thankful for that. I'm very thankful for my girlfriend, and I'm not just shouting her out because our anniversary was yesterday and I didn't give her a present. So love you, honey. And also my family has also been awesome to me and very supportive. My mom is actually here tonight in the back, and although she's not in the best health, I'm very thankful for her being a rock star parent, and my dad as well. Could I get a round of applause just for my mom for coming out here? She is awesome. And my dad is also was very good to me. He was disabled because of health problems for a long time, and even though he has been gone for 2 years because of those health issues, he taught me a lot about, even though he had a disability physically, that he could still be a great dad and a great person, a great husband, and that instilled a lot into me. And then also this instructor that I had, who was the head of a programming course at a career center I went to, and that taught me a lot about having people that, even though they weren't autistic, I had interests with them. And that helped me have a playground where I could kind of test socialization with topics that I was familiar with and really get to know peers that I didn't feel like would judge me as much. And that was also where I started to get into leadership and coming up and doing public speaking. And that was kind of a breeding ground for a lot of these skills I have now. I also went through a lot of therapy, counseling, and just working with disability services. Again, I think there's no shame in needing that help. If you need that help, then you need it. And in terms of therapy specifically, you'd be surprised how many people actually do go through that process because, again, humans are complex social creatures and we have problems. A lot of us may have problems we don't want to admit. And so there's no shame in getting that addressed to be a better person. And in my case, I had to go through those motions. Excuse me. So, in disability services, the kind of the same thing is being willing to put your pride aside, especially when you're higher functioning and sometimes think you're past this and then realize there are issues you still have to address. And in general, trial and error, like with those examples I gave, I had to learn to realize that, hey, going and talking to people about how I want to hurt myself is not socially appropriate. Some people may actually find it kind of creepy. That may explain why I was single for so long. And so I had to learn from that feedback and learn how to take it in stride and make those improvements because I didn't really know anyone else with autism who did get it, so to say. And so there was just a long learning process and being willing not to give up because it is very demoralizing. Like, imagine, I'm sure everyone's had this at some point, although probably not as much as me, going to a party and not knowing anyone, and every time you try to talk to someone, it just goes down in flames. That's basically me, except instead of having an idea in your head of what you want to do, the idea was garbage from the start. That's kind of how bad it could be. And I honestly think, because I mentioned earlier, I don't want to be a representation of what all autism looks like, that I am very fortunate. I've had wonderful people to support me, and I had wonderful parents, and in general, I've had a lot of opportunities I don't think a lot of people will get for whatever reason, a lot of times just being in the right place, the right time. And so, for example, I have friends I went to high school with that I'm still in contact with who have autism, some more severe, and one of them is homeless right now, and has been homeless for quite a long time and bounces between different couches because he cannot hold employment or find a place to stay because he never really got those opportunities and was able to develop in a way that he could compensate for his issues. I have another friend who's had a lot of really strained family issues and is also in a position of poverty. And as we'll talk about with severe autism later on, there's a large segment of the disabled population that is just forgotten because they don't have those resources. So again, I don't want to be the representation of what it looks like, maybe of what it looks like to be high functioning and to get to a point where this doesn't affect me as much anymore, but it's still an issue as a society we haven't really addressed properly. Okay, severe autism. So, does anyone here, if you're willing to share, have a family member, friend, whatnot, who has severe autism? And would you be willing to share what their specific traits are compared to more mild?
I have two young sons with what would be termed as severe autism or low functioning. They do attend school, but I think the biggest thing that they struggle with is they are completely nonverbal. My almost 13-year-old boy said a sentence to me on his own this weekend. So we're making progress. And as far as social communication, he kind of is unaware of the rest of the world. He doesn't really care about social norms. He'd happily run around this room naked. And any of you who have skin showing, get ready because you're getting a raspberry. And I don't have too many issues with this because he's trying to make contact with people. He's trying. So I'd probably say being nonverbal is the biggest struggle for them, other than, wanting every day to be naked day.
Well, don't we all? Yep, and with my girlfriend's work over at her social work clinic, nonverbal is the thing they primarily work on because you can't really be verbal if you can't do nonverbal, really. Does anyone else have one more? No? That's okay. Okay. So, with severe autism, there may be some little harsh bits in here in terms of just talking about the reality of it, because when we say severe, we do mean there are problems there that often cannot be addressed to a point of gaining independence. So with severe autism, we see, of course, nonverbal behavior, sometimes only making sounds. We see a lack of manning and tacting, which is something you may see in small children who do not have autism. So those would be things like, if I want water bottle, I would just say water bottle, or I would gesture to go for the water bottle or ask for it. Those things we take for granted may often not be seen in people with severe autism, even as they get older. And zero interest in peers is another thing. It's one thing to have interest and not know how to approach them, but, and as the woman over here mentioned, it's different when there's just no interest at all. And because you have to think, again, with how social our society is, how isolated someone would be if they just never wanted to see people, and how different that looks compared to just, say, shyness, or even someone just having mild autism. Violent tantrums, again, I don't know how prevalent this is with everyone with severe autism, but I do know there are a lot of cases of it. There was a video I originally had, but I didn't put it up here because I was worried about time constraints. But it was a young man who lived with his mom, and he was probably about 25, and he was nonverbal, but he also had very violent tantrums. So when they're going through with the camera crew in the home, there's holes in the walls, the air conditioning's been broken, things are flipped over, and just very, very destructive signs that unfortunately are there sometimes as taking out anger or just for the sake of it. Unfortunately, it's something that can be tempered, but it's often still there in some form. And then the big one is the inability to perform many everyday tasks without assistance. Things that we take for granted, such as the ability to cook a meal or do laundry, may be something that they struggle with. And I did live, because I had an IEP in high school, which allowed me to receive disability services, I had an opportunity to live in kind of this apartment/dorm where I had a lot of people around me who had severe or more moderate to severe autism. And I saw cases of this, of a complete lack of filter. As she mentioned, we saw things like people who would just leave pizza boxes and food, just straight up food everywhere, not being able to really form words in a coherent way at all. These things that are not just heartbreaking, but when you think about it, how do you improve these things when they get to a certain age, and how do you give them purpose? And that's a big ethical dilemma. Now, one thing that has emerged in the past few decades that has been really successful with people with more severe autism is ABA therapy, although it's not used just for that. This is what my girlfriend does in her social work job. So it stands for Applied Behavioral Analysis. It is primarily for small children with severe autism, especially those who are nonverbal. It uses things like positive reinforcement, repetition, tailored programs that provide a reward and incentive to improve to help children with severe autism. And it does show, both from actually watching it happen and from research, there are immense amount of improvements. And there are some arguments against it. A lot of it is that it's too intense, that you may have kids who are there 30 hours a week, for example. But my argument, and my girlfriend's argument as well, has been when you have someone with very severe autism in our society where unfortunately there may not be a lot of empathy for them and there may still be a stigma, you have to be willing to do these things to get them to a point where they can have a chance at functioning somewhat on their own, because once it's there, you're running against the clock before those things cannot be undone, because development when they're young is so precious, and as they get older, it's harder to help relieve those things. But again, because it's severe autism, those things are still there. It's still something that they may never fully overcome, and even with ABA, they may not overcome much of it at all. It's all dependent on the person. There is a ceiling to it, and without the intervention of medication or any other things that come in the future, may never be able to really resolve these issues for people who have severe autism, unfortunately. And again, that slide did not display properly, but that's not what matters. So the harsh reality of severe autism is that the majority will either live in assisted living, which, like I mentioned, there are a lot of those facilities that have continuously been popping up around America for people with severe autism or similar disabilities, or they may just stay home for their entire lives because they simply cannot function on their own and there is a need for that help. And again, someone with Asperger's or moderate autism may still receive help, but the difference is the degree of independence and the degree of social functioning. And like I mentioned, it's extremely straining on families to have to constantly deal with those things, the arguments, the tantrums, and also the heartbreak that comes with knowing that this person may never experience a lot of the things you take for granted, of just being able to have a conversation with someone without having to worry about judgment or tantrums, that kind of thing. And generally, employment's also an issue, of course, because even if they get a job, which many will not, without assistance because of the interview process, again, very socially dependent, especially when there's competition. Even withholding it because you have to know to show up to work on time, do tasks that you may be unfamiliar with, work with others, work with customers, that's where you run into issues. And there's also just not enough funding, unfortunately, because when you think of things, not just budget cuts, but the amount of people who may have severe autism and the amount of money that may be required to either have resources or just people to help them around the clock, it's just not there. And so a lot of the social workers I've interviewed on this topic have been very bothered by this. There's an ethical dilemma there. Not just because there's not enough funding to help everyone, but also if someone has severe autism and they have a point where they are just going to be assisted, they can't progress any further at a certain point, at what point do you give those resources to someone else? At what point is it just too much that you have to devote resources to others? And that's a question that there isn't an easy answer to, like many things when we discuss very severe disabilities. I have a paper version of this in the back when you're on your way out, but I did provide some resources related to autism in general. I had a little playlist I threw together with some informational videos on it. AutismSpeaks.org is a very good information resource. WrongPlanet.net is actually a forum just for people with autism or parents to talk. It's still very active. It's a very good community. It's also good to talk to any certified psychologist specializing in ASD. Also, since I forgot to mention this earlier, if you suspect a relative or a child of yours may have autism spectrum disorder, usually what you would do is talk to your pediatrician or whoever your child's doctor is, and they will refer you from there, because we don't want to misdiagnose, and there's, again, so many different symptoms that you often have to go through a few specialists just to make sure they get the help they may need. ABA clinics are pretty common. I did not list any others because I'm not super familiar with them, otherwise I would have listed more. So ABA Pathways is where my girlfriend works. That's a shameless plug, but that's over in Saginaw, and I know they're very good. I know there's one actually right down the road from us. I think it's over on East Lawn or Swede. ABA Connections, I believe it is. And disability services at any educational institution are really good about giving help. All right. Now we've come to the fun part. We're going to talk about autism in the workplace. So, has anyone here, to your knowledge, besides me, worked with someone who has autism spectrum disorder, here or anywhere else? All right, you're pointing you out as a bit of cheating, Rhonda, but all right, anyone else? What is it about working with them that is different? Anyone? Okay, all right. I was going to let Rhonda cheat, but yes?
I think it helps to be patient. I think a lot of times the IQ is a lot higher than EQ. And that gets lost. Communication.
Yep, and the patience is a huge thing, and even for me, as I've gotten better with dealing with workplace environments, I still ask patience of my coworkers a lot. Rhonda, did you have something you wanted to add?
I would say the way that they learn tasks or learn new things, the way that they learn tasks or learn new skills takes a little bit longer than a traditional person.
That's true
And
for
so sometimes repetition and examples and instructions is necessary.
Yep, and I know that's definitely the case for me when I started here, when I started my previous corporate jobs, or any job in general, really. So I did not plan this, but Dow just started a new, I guess you could call it new, corporate diversity practice, the All In initiative, I believe it is, something like that. And It's a great thing to do. I want to talk about some ethical questions or just questions in general about diversity in the workplace that may be a little uncomfortable, that we probably don't have the answers to. So, we all love diversity. Nobody would say they don't, obviously, and every corporation wants diversity. But there's a difference with disabilities, particularly with autism spectrum disorder because of the social aspect. Let me give an example. So, let's say we take a clone of anyone in this room. Let's say we have someone who works in HR, and we make a clone of them, except now with my magic cloning machine, we make them a black man. Well, nothing has changed except that piece of their identity. They can do the job just the same. Or let's say we make them transgender, or let's say we make them a woman, or whatever, all right? Nothing has changed. But what if we take this person who we're assuming beforehand has no disability, and we give them moderate autism? Well, now we have a problem, so to say, because now we have changes to certain abilities or certain traits of them that may correlate with their job. And so now we have a question of ability to do a job bumping heads with we want diversity. Does this change how hiring managers are looking at things or how managers are looking at things? Those are questions we often don't like to ask because it is uncomfortable where you get into, can a disabled person do every job that we have here? And sometimes, unfortunately, they cannot. And so the other thing is with actually getting and performing a job, because let's say you have moderate autism, and sometimes it may show more than someone with mild autism, and you go to a job interview and you get this feeling, because I've had this happen to me a long time ago, that the interviewer is kind of detecting that you have those differences, that there's things there, and you want to explain, like, I'm not stupid. Like, and I know that's a harsh word, but I've had this happen to me even recently, where you're working with someone or interviewing with them, and you want them to understand, hey, there's nothing wrong with me. I just have these things that have to be accommodated for. But even though there's a discrimination policy federally and here, there's still unconscious bias, and there's still the fact that, well, if someone has this disability, how does that affect their ability to do a job? And so then you get the disclosure dilemma, and I've experienced this a lot. Do you tell people? Do you tell this hiring manager? I made that choice once in an interview I had a few years ago, and I can't say that the person discriminated against me, but I feel like I didn't do a good job of explaining it, and so it probably worked against me, but no fault to them. With disclosure, for example, with the I-9 team I work with here in the co-ops, generally speaking, they've seen I do good work. I was doing good work before it was disclosed that I have Asperger's. And so when they find out or I make a mistake, they're not gonna think, oh, it's that autism at it again. They understand that it's part of for the course, or it's just a mistake anyone would make regardless of disability. But I've had this happen too. Let's say I'm working with someone for the first time, and I'm making these mistakes that may be specific to my Asperger's, like someone mentioned, new tasks being a problem, or the way you process things specifically. Well, now I want to explain to them, hey, I have all these issues, and this is nothing about how I do the job, it's just I need patience. But even though we can put diversity everywhere, we still have to recognize there's stigma. There's unconscious stigma. There is still concern about how people perceive people like me. And so now I have a dilemma of, do I tell this person? Do I just let them assume that I can't do my job properly? How do I explain those things? And I'm very lucky because my boss, who I disclosed my Asperger's to, was very supportive and has been very understanding. But obviously that isn't going to be the case for everyone. Some people may have a rocky experience with that. And so there's a dilemma of, do you want to embrace this diversity and be able to talk about things openly and risk that stigma, or you just hide it and risk people thinking that you're just incompetent? And even as I talk up here now, I'm thinking about that in the back of my head, because this is a can of worms I cannot close. My superpower is out. And so I have to think about that and think about the potential consequences, good or bad, of that. And so with that, I want to hand things off to Rhonda Thomas to talk about Project Search, because we talked about people with autism getting a job, performing a job, and hiring managers, how they may look at those things. So we actually have some good news to share about the future for people with these disabilities.
Thank you very much. As he stated, my name is Rhonda Thomas. I'm in HR operations, but I'm also the business liaison for Project Search. Project Search, for those that aren't aware, is an internship program we participate in that employs people with moderate cognitive or developmental disabilities. They get 3 internships over a school year, 10 weeks at a time, and they rotate through 3 different jobs. And we've been doing it here in Midland for 2 years. It's in a variety of other sites as well. And we've employed 12 interns, and we've hired 3 of those interns. Now, I'm not always privy from a HIPAA perspective on their disabilities, but of course, autism is one of the developmental disabilities. And there is a gentleman that had disclosed through his family that his disability was autism. And part of Project Search is when you rotate through the internships, one of the skills we want them to develop is the interview skill. As we've learned, it's very, very difficult for somebody who has social skill issues to interview. This person has moderate autism. And we worked and coached, and we worked through this interview, and they interview with every single work group that's participating, and then that work group would rank the people on which one they'd like in their rotation next. 100% of the time, this intern was ranked last. Nobody could see a value in working with this intern because he was verbal, but not appropriately so in a workplace setting, even through a variety of coaching. Because of the program, we place the interns. They know they're going to go somewhere, so we force the chance for them. So this intern was placed into what we call an MSDS project. There was a project that the government passed down. They made some changes to MSDS sheets. Variety of information needed to be added to these sheets. We have over 20,000 of them at Dow. And there were a large number of things that needed to be updated. The EH&S team had decided they would put about 20 people on it over a year. It wasn't going to be full-time, but it was going to be added to their jobs. They knew they were going to miss the deadline. There would likely be a fine. They heard about Project Search. They said, hey, when we placed this intern in, they said, if this person can do 100 of them, that's 100 we don't have to do. So they were happy. But right there was the unconscious bias. They met this intern and said, the best this intern can do is 100. That was their first decision. We knew it was going to be different. The important thing is to find their skill set and place them in something that works for them. Over that 10-week period, that intern completed 85% of those MSDS sheets with 100% accuracy. The entire program was done in 12 weeks. And all 20,000 plus were updated and completely done before the deadline with no fines to Dow. So that's a huge business impact. And we blew the people away. Second rotation, or maybe it was a third rotation, another rotation, we have a variety of drawings. Okay, in 1980, in the 80s, the drawings started to become digitized with the CAD/CAM programs, but we've been around since well before 1980. So we have a large number of drawings, piping and electrical and blueprints, that if somebody needs to be able to make a change to a building, they've got to drive to this building where the physical drawing is and make a copy, or they got to call somebody and they got to go make these copies off these little microfiche films to upload it so that they can make changes. We have hundreds of thousands of drawings from way back in the 1900s, I guess. So one of the projects they said is, hey, let's take these microfiche. They put it in this very antiquated old machine that I don't believe they make anymore, that literally breaks down every single day. And they upload them onto the server so that these engineers who are doing work can just download them. The average person, we've had contractors working on it, we've had Dow employees, we had other interns working on it, can average about 20 a day on a good day. And they usually had to call the technician in. Not only did this intern learn how to fix the machine, we don't know how, so we didn't have to call a technician in. His average is 200 a day. And so we hired him as a Dow employee after the end of the program because it makes a business sense. Now, you can't carry on a conversation with him very easily. He has intense focus on Disney movies and Disney songs. There's a variety of things that are awkward about him, but because we gave him the chance, he is very successful and Dow's very successful. So I think it's finding the skill, understanding what they're capable of, and not making the judgments of what you think they can do is what's really important.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, we are going to wrap up before we get to Q&A. So as Rhonda pointed out, I really do think, as she said, that is where the future lies for people with forms of autism in the workplace. It may be someone who can kind of pass for quote-unquote normal that can do any other job, or it may be someone who it may actually be more valuable to have someone with autism because they can do these very specific things. Because whether we like it or not, there's going to be those kind of tasks that need to be done, and I can imagine people in here from all experience levels have had something tacked on like that has to be done, and it makes things a lot more stressful when instead you could have someone who can do that, even if it's just that. And from a business perspective, really be a trailblazer in those kind of things. And so I think that very specific placement and being willing to take that cost up front for better business decisions in the long run is where we'll hopefully go. So we have some Q&A. So this is from a webcast. So the first question is, so is it a myth then that those with mild autism are overintelligent or almost genius, which we call savant? Someone who is an autistic savant, which I guess is what Sheldon Cooper is on The Big Bang Theory, so to say, supposed to be this genius because of his autism. People who are savant autists are extremely rare. I have not met one personally. Because in general, having an intellect that high is already rare, and so at that point, it's already a chance, some very small chance they will have it in general, let alone have it mixed with having autism. So no, that myth is not true. The overwhelming vast majority are not savants. All right, do we have any questions in the audience?
I have a comment
Yes.
on that specific.
Often when I share about my children both having autism to the general public, they will ask me, well, what do they do? What is their special talent? So everyone kind of thinks that they must be able to play a piano virtuoso or be artistic. I say, no, they just happen to have autism. So it's funny how the general population really does believe that and says, ooh, what's their special skill? So.
Yeah, I hope nobody with that perception is watching this or here and then expects special talent from me and my job, because I'm going to disappoint you more than usual. Anyone else?
Hi, Jeremiah. I
Hello.
started working with you maybe, 6 weeks ago? And we had a kind of an old style paper process we had to do in HR. And you and I were working together on this, and I said, we're going to have to sign our names and fill it in. We can't do it electronically. And you kind of shut down on me, right? You were like, you got to be kidding me. I've got to sign my name. And so I had no clue what your background was. And I took it as a generational thing. And I thought, he is this computer whiz. He's doing everything electronically. I'm old style. And so we accommodated because I could tell you were really annoyed by it. But I felt I was in the wrong because we're using this archaic process. And so we accommodated, and you found a way to do it electronically, and everybody won. And it was only later that you shared this with me. So I just want to thank you for doing the presentation today for us, and I'm really proud of you. You've done a great job.
Thank you. With that, what I ended up doing is taking the pre-made copies of the I-9 forms and then going in through the Adobe editor and putting in the information that would have to be filled out normally, and then I'd make like 7 copies of different files and change it depending on the situation. So if I had a birth certificate instead of a social security card, I would just pull that copy. And when you consider it was maybe 100 forms, that saves a lot of time, considering that I have everything else I have to do in the day. Anyone else?
So when I think about my experience with Project Search and the interview, I mean, the interviews didn't go well with a lot of our interns with more moderate disabilities, at least in the beginning. What would your advice be for someone? Because I know we as Dow, we probably need to change a little bit and learn and grow about how we interview. But until that happens more culturally, what would your advice be to manage with your special talents in a traditional interview that you expect?
In my experience early on, when I was starting to interview, because later on as I did become better with socialization, I didn't have to compensate as much. I think it's important to be prepared, and I think that's obviously something you would tell anyone, but be prepared for anything that could throw you off. Any question about you, about your behavior. I think rehearsing those things and having backup plans is very important, even if it's just, I mean, I did this for practicing for this whole event, was I talked to myself in my car a lot of the time to kill the 30-minute commute. And I think just having those social experiences prepared and practicing is very important. And I also think finding ways to roll with the punches, even if it's just sometimes making a quick joke or laughing at yourself. I do self-depreciating humor a lot. I think that's also important with not taking yourself too seriously, because even nowadays, I still get really angry with myself. I get down on myself because I sometimes think, you know, I could be doing so much more in my life if I didn't have this. Because, for example, I'm really into martial arts, and I want to do jiu-jitsu and judo, which are two martial arts. And I would go to judo class, and I would, because part of autism is the repetitive movement and the lack of coordination, I would struggle so much with things I've been training on for months, and just feel like I come in one day and suddenly cannot do anything, and everybody's throwing me like it's nothing. And it's a really awful feeling. And it's a reminder sometimes that I have to roll with the punches and not take myself too seriously, and that it is what it is. And all I can do is compensate. Anyone else?
Was there a specific age that was harder for you versus?
Yes. When I was in middle school, it was probably the worst time of my life ever, because in middle school, that is where, I mean, kids are very cruel creatures in general, let's be real, especially in middle school, because that's where things that you see in high school start to emerge, but in a more immature state. Things like cliques and the horrible monster known as puberty starts to rear its ugly head, and all these things start. And especially because everybody is very mean-spirited and very cliquey in middle school, and you are someone with autism who, depending on what your experience was when in grade school, maybe you were okay, maybe you were already kind of struggling, but for me, I was okay. I was kind of just, everyone was friends with everyone, but then I didn't know how to fit in. I didn't know who my quote-unquote clique was supposed to be. I didn't know how to really make friends, and so when things changed, I was just a complete outcast. And that was probably some of the worst times of my life, of being suicidal and legitimately, no exaggeration, having not a single friend for most of middle school. I think it got better towards the end of high school because people start to realize that picking on others is completely pointless, obviously. And college especially, because people are too busy being stressed about school and drowning in student loan debt, that they realize that whoever you're with is whoever you're with, and you'll find those friends a lot easier, especially when you can focus on specific interests in being classes with people who have those and clubs and such.
Hi, Jeremiah. What
Hello, Gerald.
advice would you, what advice would you give to people that do have autism in particular, that might be watching or maybe seeing this down the road, about getting your foot in the door in an interview process, most particularly with assessment tests? I have a buddy in particular that probably will be watching this down the road. I'm going to be sending it to him because I know it's online. About he has a really tough time getting past the assessment tests as an individual whole. Those those question-based tests that determine if you get into the door or the person wants to interview you. Just kind of getting your foot into that interview process, I feel like, is a really difficult phase for a lot of people with autism, not just the interview process as a whole. What advice do you have for those people by chance?
So is the assessment thing like the kind of skill inventories they have? Because I know we had those for Dow. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, like the skill inventories
Gotcha.
or other companies that use the assessment tests.
Yeah, with those, I think because the skill inventory is not the end all be all, a lot of the time, I think the most important thing in general for getting into these kind of environments when you have autism is your connections. Because especially in academia, because my instructor that I had up there always was giving me recommendations. He was always referring me to people who could help me meet more people that worked at places like Dow. Finding people that believe in you and recognize your talents, like you'd be amazed at how far a lot of teachers and professors and people in those settings will go to help you improve and help you find meaning and things to do with your career if they recognize you have talent. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of it is you just have to keep going and being willing to take feedback in stride. And a lot of this sounds like, I'm just regurgitating what you hear all the time. But it's like that, except you have to amp it up with autism. You have to keep doing these things. It's going to be harder, but as I hope me being up here in the first place indicate, it's definitely possible. And so my advice would simply be to find those connections, to, even if it stresses you out more, be willing to go above and beyond to find people who will put you in the position to be successful. Anyone else? Whoever gets the microphone, I suppose.
So as a question, we've talked a little bit about, somebody who might be on the spectrum in the workplace, but for coworkers, maybe a manager, what have you, what suggestions do you have for maybe accommodations that people might want to consider as maybe somebody else from one of the groups or whatever starts to work within your team, and certain considerations, accommodations, anything like that?
Yep. Real quick, I do see things coming up from the webcast, so I will get to those in a little bit. I just wanted to make sure I get people in the room too. But for people who are coworkers, or especially hiring managers, I think the two tenets are patience and then being open to ideas. Because with giving specific accommodations, because it's such a wide spectrum, especially with things like the need for a private office or methods of dealing with socializing, it's hard to pin down specific things, but you can get past that by being open to listening to ideas, like with my manager being willing to hear me out, that even if you hear sometimes negative things from people who do not know I have this disability, that this is what's going on. And setting up an environment where that can be an open and honest conversation, I think is very important, because like I said, we know there's a stigma. We know that there's unconscious bias, and we know we're gonna get looked at in odd ways when our behavior is on display, and we can't help it. And so that, and just being patient and showing patience, I think are the most important things, because trust me, nothing upsets me more with myself when I know someone is frustrated, even if it's my fault, because I know I am failing them in my mind, that upsets me. And so just seeing patience always helps me. So I hope that answers that. Okay, so the webcast. I know a teenager on the Asperger's end of the spectrum who has never been diagnosed officially. He doesn't know he is on the spectrum. Is it better to not get a diagnosis and treat him normally, or should he know he is on the spectrum? That is actually a very good question. So what I would say is, and this depends on how much it impacts their daily life, but I think if it's to a point, because at some point you do have questions of identity and how that may affect them, because everyone will react to that kind of thing differently, I would think that if it affects them enough that they need help in things, that you should approach them about looking to get diagnosed. And they should also be reminded that there's no shame in it, that not just autism, but disabilities are very common, and that it's not some kind of death sentence to your ability to function. Clearly, because I'm up here doing whatever we call this lecturing, so it's not a death sentence to your ability. And so I think there should be an open conversation about that with that person, and that if it is something that is impacting them, they should be urged to go look into having it looked at. I hope that makes sense. I'm really tired. Okay. Along the lines about interview questions and working with people with disability, is it appropriate to ask an individual if they need an accommodation? Or is it only appropriate to A, be clear about the ways DAO supports and accommodates, and then B, wait for a person to volunteer information? I think you do, and there may be some federal law stuff about this, I don't know, but I feel like you need to wait, because first of all, depending on how you go about it, straight up going up to someone and being like, hey, do you need an accommodation? If they have that, they may have a red flag over their head like, oh, I've been figured out, or that kind of thing. And that can be very uncomfortable for some people. It may throw off how they adapt to a job at first. And in general, I think you have to let them want to get assistance. You cannot help someone who does not want help. And that's a very general rule, but especially for someone who needs accommodations, they have to be willing. Were you going to intervene?
Yeah, sorry. That wraps up our time. I wanted to give Jeremiah a huge round of applause. Public Public speaking is not an easy thing to do, let alone when you're up here talking about something so personal. This is exactly what, as the co-chairs of DEN, we're trying to do, is break down those stigmas of disabilities. It's okay to talk about. We're very thankful that we have our own employees to showcase and get this conversation going. Next month, we have Alan Reno and his service animals, and he is going to come educate and talk about that. So thank you all for taking the time out of your day. Although it's not your core job, it's important to Down. I appreciate you all being here. Thank you.
I've been told through rumor that people have to go back.